It's important to point out that, this is a very spiritually dangerous
Yeah.
ideology to get involved
Oh
with,
yeah.
even to a lesser degree in the Catholic world, because envy and resentment are spiritually deadly.
Hmm.
Envy is a deadly sin.
Yeah.
So if you get into the mindset, even if not on your personal behalf, but on behalf of the group that you belong to, that any kind of difference, and we're not even talking about, um, you know, dire poverty or things like that, but just, how well are we represented in this field, or, how often does my face show up on the big screen, or, that kind of thing. Uh, there can be a good way of working towards those things, of encouraging, if people of your ethnic group, you feel like there's untapped talent in mathematics, among people of your ethnic group, then that's a fine thing to encourage. You also have to look at what are the cultural things in my ethnic group that are maybe holding those things back, right? As well as what are the external obstacles. That's something that somebody like John McWhorter would talk about, where there's like certain ethnic groups have like almost an anti-intellectual or an anti-education popular bias. But the idea that you're going to look at others and blame them and resent them for being more represented in a certain profession, or whatever the topic is, that's profoundly spiritually poisonous. So people should be warned about that as well.
Well, this brings me to a really important issue that has sort of come up in the last year or two since discussion of critical race theory and related ideas um, started to enter the news, which is that among the bits of disinformation that are thrown out by defenders of critical race theory is the idea that critical race theory is really just a matter of teaching the history of racism and informing people about it, letting
Mm-hmm.
them become better informed about it.
Right.
And naturally, anybody hearing that thinks, well, yeah, well, how can you object to that? I mean, what's the problem with that? But
Right.
that's a complete bait and switch. That's not what it's about. In fact, proponents of critical race theory, both the academic theorists who originated it and also the popularizers, people like Kendi and D'Angelo and so forth, um, they emphasize that the core insight, as they think of it, of critical race theory has nothing to do with what most people think of as racism. When most people hear racism, they think of things like the Ku Klux Klan. They think of slavery in the old American South. They think of Jim Crow laws, segregation. They think of the system in South Africa that was overthrown, I guess 20 years ago now, whenever it was. They think, okay, that's racism, and everybody agrees that that's bad. And so if we're teaching about that kind of thing, then well, people should know about that. But these writers are explicit. That's not what we're talking about. They hold that even if you get rid of all that stuff, the situation of non-whites would really remain essentially unchanged. They say that
Hmm.
because the kind of racism they claim to identify is much more subtle. In fact, it's so subtle that you have to be a critical race theorist to identify it. You have to be an adept in the
Yeah.
literature, and this is where you get concepts like microaggressions and implicit bias and all this
Right.
kind of stuff. And this idea that even so-called progressives and liberals are really deep down as racist as everybody else. This is what the average person on the street doesn't understand when they hear this nonsense that, well, it's just about teaching the history of racism. Right? No, it's a much more radical sort of vision than that. So, uh, according to these writers, um, the way that the racism they're criticizing manifests itself is in biases that people who exhibit them don't even know they have. And they have in mind people like, say, you could think of the white progressive voter who thinks of himself as liberal and progressive, hates Donald Trump and, would never vote Republican his life depended on, and so forth. But such a person, nevertheless, is racist without knowing it because, according to the theory, they have unnoticed biases, implicit biases. That's the jargon, and uh, they routinely manifest microaggressions, which are um, aggressive in the sense of condescending or critical or in some other way hostile attitudes or actions toward people of color that they're not even aware that they are manifesting. So that every time, say, a white person is not sufficiently pleasant at work, say, to a non-white person, or doesn't smile when they pass a jogger who's not white or something, this counts as a quote microaggression. And if the person says, "What? No, I was just having a bad day, or I didn't even see the person, I wasn't even thinking about it." Well, that's what you think, but it's really sort of white
Right.
privilege and white condescension coming out. It's this kind of extremely paranoid uh, worldview where racism is read into absolutely everything that uh, so-called anti-racist education is really about. And I think a lot of people who think, well, yeah, if you're just teaching about racism, how can anybody object to that? They don't realize that that's not the problem. That's not what is being criticized or objected to. What's objected to is this extreme theory that posits racism everywhere, including places you wouldn't expect it. Let me give you another
Right.
example, even more important example. People typically think of the fight against racism in the United States, in the history of our country for the last 40, 50 years or so, in terms of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, in terms of figures like Martin Luther King Jr., in terms of things like anti-discrimination laws and treating everyone the same, whatever race they are, and so forth. But critical race theory also explicitly rejects all that, and it says that anti-discrimination laws actually benefit whites. And the idea of color blindness, Kendi in his book calls that, the most dangerous sort of racism, that it really upholds white supremacy rather than allowing us to overthrow it.
Hmm.
What we really need is a regime of discrimination against whites and in favor of non-whites in order to redress
Right.
the so-called racist inequities that Kendi claims to identify. The whole idea of individual rights, of free speech, and of rationalism, of a sort of common human rationality that we can all appeal to in order to settle our disputes, all of that is rejected as somehow inherently racist and just as a smokescreen for the racist oppressor. Now, I submit
Right.
that most people, even most Democratic voters and people who would think of themselves as liberal and progressive, if they knew that that's what's being peddled under this label of anti-racism and critical race theory, they'd say, "Whoa, wait a sec! I don't want my kids being taught that. I don't think those are good ideas." Um, so anyway, that's a bit of disinformation that that proponents of these ideas have been coming to hide behind over the last year or two, since these ideas started to get very wide circulation and to be widely discussed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just to bring it back to the spiritual level, I mean, with something like microaggressions, it's like even when if such things do exist to some extent, or in life, I mean, we could all say there are little inconsiderate behavior of people, or just little weird vibes that people give us, not necessarily in a racial way, but those things happen. But I mean, if you're looking for things to accuse people of, you're looking for grievances, you're looking for things to complain about. Again, there's this aspect of self-pity, there's this aspect of resentment, like you said, a paranoid orientation towards other people. There's an aspect of just of self-importance to it that, it's like, if you're looking at what we're supposed to be like as Christians, is this decreasing that Christ may increase in us? Is this really following the example of Christ to be constantly concerned about every possible little, micro infringement on our ego, or whatever? I mean,
Yeah, it's like we're
we're
replacing.
all supposed to be embracing humiliation. If there is something, real or imagined, we're all supposed to be embracing, look, if it's a consistent thing, you can tell someone about it. Hey, I don't like this little thing you do, or things like that. But we're supposed to be embracing, death to self. We're supposed to be embracing humiliation, like, and that's all of us. And it doesn't matter whether you can come up with an ideology to justify justify the fact that you are not willing to just sort of like take the little buffets of life. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Well, it's like, when Christ says, when someone slaps your cheek, turn the other cheek, right? We're replacing that with, well, he didn't slap your cheek, but you should suspect that he probably wanted to, and he was thinking about it. I mean, it's
Right.
exactly the opposite
Right.
attitude.
Right.
It's this attitude of being suspicious of everybody of a certain race, and of reading hostile intent and reading this sort of paranoid worldview into phenomena that are
Yeah.
either entirely innocent, or if they can be criticized, they can be criticized without having to appeal to these exotic ideas of implicit bias and microaggressions, all this kind of thing. As I note in the book, some have pointed out that um, the literature of critical race theory really teaches people to take on board attitudes very similar to those that in cognitive behavioral therapy are recommended against, because they tend to generate
Right.
anxiety and depression. So if you go around, for example, reading people's minds and thinking that they have it out for you, and where a social engagement, a social interaction was uncomfortable, that it must have been because they're hostile to you, they mean you harm, and so forth. Um, that or what sometimes called catastrophizing, right, where you always assume that the worst is likely to happen, and that those who disagree with you intend the worst for you, and so forth. And there are a number of these mindsets that you can get yourself into. Um, Focusing only on the negative and not letting yourself
Yeah.
focus on evidence against some negative interpretation of things. These are mental habits that in cognitive behavioral therapy are often identified as among the chief sources of anxiety disorders and of depression disorders.
Right.
And yet they're exactly the sorts of things that wokeness in general and critical race theory in particular tend to imbibe in their readers. It teaches people to be paranoid and to go around thinking
Yeah.
that, a whole group of people has it out for you, and all of society is hostile to you. And even when they pretend they're not, that's a smokescreen. That's a lie. Don't believe what you see. And so this is a totally paranoid worldview, which is, of course, people are going to be angry and hostile to one another, and you're going to have increased social tension. And then one of the worst things about it is it tends to invite overreaction on the other side. So naturally, you're going to get jerks on the other side who fall precisely into racist attitudes, because they think, well, if you're going to call me a racist anyway, I'm going to act like that, right? That's totally the wrong lesson to draw. But you end up stirring up so much
Right.
hostility between people that it leads to this sort of polarization and mutual hatred, and then it just
Right.
ratchets up. It's a kind of death spiral. Um, and
Yeah, it's
naturally,
really
then it's
unfortunate.
spiritually unhealthy, and it's exactly opposite to what Christ teaches us in the Sermon on the Mount.
Right. Yeah. There can be sort of a narcissism too. I've seen people refer to this as ethno narcissism, or racial narcissism, where everything, even on issues that seem totally unrelated to race, that you somehow manage to make it about that. This is about me. This is about my group. To take things that are about the whole church, celebrating something good that happened. Oh, well, like a good example would be like the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I saw self-proclaimed black Catholics on Twitter. It's not just a descriptor. Some people use it almost as though it's like a separate rite, of the Catholic Church or something, who were complaining about it, like, oh, how is this going to affect, racial, just things, just totally insignificant things next to this incredible victory of overturning, the universal legality of abortion in America,
Right.
and making it about things. And I'm not even talking about like serious concerns, but just small
Yeah.
little,
Yeah.
just in the same way that that a self-proclaimed Catholic feminist might say, well, I actually saw an article in I think it was an American magazine, by a Catholic feminist saying, well, I'm not happy about this Texas ban on abortions because, until misogyny is eradicated, then, we can't have this. We
Yeah.
can't celebrate this
Right.
victory. And it's just this concern with self, this narcissism on
Yeah.
behalf of yourself or your group. And it's a narcissism that gets passed because everybody's afraid to criticize it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you can clothe it in a social justice garb, but it's really just about yourself. It's really just
Well,
about
I mean,
wanting attention.
fanaticism in all its forms, ultimately, I think that, the deep psychological, well, I don't want to oversimplify, but one of the psychological roots of it is a kind of narcissism, because the more fanatical and extreme your position, the more unlikely it's ever going to be realized. And that means there's more for you to criticize, right? We don't yet have utopia, whatever utopia is, however you define utopia. Therefore, I can sit back and criticize society and feel good about myself and portray and express my virtue by criticizing things. One way I think about it is this: is that Take an issue like abortion, right? Now, I'm as, opposed as abortion to anybody, but I would be the last person to say that everything somehow is about abortion. That would be ridiculous. If you're discussing some new movie, hey, what'd you think of the new Top Gun movie? What'd you think of the new Thor movie? Well, I didn't say enough about abortion. It's like, wait, what are you talking about? Not everything's about abortion, right? And if I say that, it's
Right,
not because I
right.
don't take abortion seriously. It's just because, to quote the line attributed to Freud, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It's not a symbol.
Right,
It's
right.
not an opportunity
Yeah.
to pontificate about our socio-cultural ethical situation. It's just a cigar. Calm down, right? And sometimes a movie is just a movie, and sometimes a political event or a piece of legislation about abortion is just about abortion. It's not about race. It's not about sexism. It's just about abortion or whatever, right? So just like it would be
Right.
absurd for a pro-lifer, someone who is against abortion, to bring abortion to every issue, and if he did so, it would be a kind of performance art, right? Someone who did that, you think, look, would you just shut up? You're just trying to show us all how anti-abortion you are because you're bringing abortion to everything, right? The same thing's true with bringing race into
Right, right,
everything.
right, right.
It's because race is
Right.
not really part of everything, but you make it sound like it is. You think you sound more virtuous because you see it everywhere. Other people don't, right? And some people are actually intimidated by this kind of idiocy, right? Oh, I don't want to criticize this per, otherwise I'll be a racist, what have you. But it's just like if somebody said, speaking, for myself as someone who's against abortion, if someone was bringing abortion to everything, how did you like dinner the other night at the restaurant? Well, there wasn't anything on the table about abortion rights, anti-abortion right? Come on, not everything's about that. In the same way, if someone tries to bring race into everything, they should simply be ignored, and people shouldn't be
Yeah.
intimidated by that because it's not everything is about that.